officials, authorities, elected or not, are becoming fearful of their citizens and their people and are constructing us as a mass that must be controlled, segmented. Right now, who control that technology, control the world.
Can we regulate AI technology before it's too late? There's a scene in the new Mission Impossible movie which takes place in Abu Dhabi airport. In it, Tom Cruise is running through the terminal looking for a suspect with the help of facial recognition systems that are installed in the airport's security cameras. The cameras can identify a specific person among thousands and track them across the terminal. This isn't science fiction, by the way. This technology already exists and it's in use by police forces. In China, it's been rolled out to hundreds of millions, yes, millions of CCTV cameras across its major cities. These cameras use AI and machine learning to quickly identify people's faces, their clothing, license plate numbers, and even read their facial expressions. In some cities, residents use facial scanning to enter their workplaces, their homes, to pay for food at restaurants. These systems are all integrated too, so if you run a red light or fail to pay your taxes, you might suddenly find yourself shut out of public transport or unable to buy food at McDonald's. It's only the tip of the iceberg, and as AI technology advances at a rate that's hard to comprehend, police and security institutions are pushing to roll this technology out in cities around the world, arguing it helps solve crimes and protect neighborhoods. It's already been tested widely across the UK, the US, and France. Earlier this year, the French Parliament passed a law allowing its technology to be used for crowd control during the 2024 Paris Olympic Games. Human rights groups sounded the alarm, saying it was setting a dangerous precedent, leading us into a future where governments have unrestricted surveillance and control over the lives of their citizens. The European Union is currently debating an AI bill that attempts to put some brake pads onto this technology, but tech companies are fighting back, saying these regulations will only slow down the advancement of the AI revolution we are now witnessing. So how does this surveillance technology actually impact our lives? And should we be worried that we're sleepwalking into a future no one wants to live in? Welcome to The Big Picture, a show about the past, the present, and the future. My name is Mohammed Hassan, and today on the show we are speaking to the Secretary General of Amnesty International, Agnes Callamard. Dr. Callamard is one of the boldest human rights voices of our generation. She was the former Special Rapporteur on Executions at the United Nations Human Rights Council, as well as the former Director of the Columbia University Global Freedom of Expression Project. In 2021, she called for a moratorium on surveillance technology after news of the Pegasus hacking scandal broke, and this year urged France not to implement its mass surveillance plans for the Olympics. So what does she think about the AI revolution and the new wave of surveillance technology that comes along with it? Dr. Agnes Callamard, thank you very much for being with us. Welcome to The Big Picture.
Thank you very much for having me.
I want to have a conversation with you about mass surveillance and technology.
Yeah.
When it comes to the idea of mass surveillance, there usually is two groups of thought when it comes to how to approach it. On one camp, you have people that say this is an abuse of power. This is something that infringes on personal rights, personal freedom of movement, and that we should try and limit it as much as possible. The other camp says this is a, if necessary, evil, but something that is necessary, something that allows all of us as citizens to live safe, protected, free lives. Where do you sit between these two camps?
Oh, we definitely sit on the side
you're
of
all the way over
those
here.
who are finding mass surveillance to be a major threat to human rights currently and in the future. It's a threat to freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and importantly, it's a threat to the right to equality and to non-discrimination. Because increasingly, you're describing something that is massive, but that is also specific. In other words, mass surveillance can be quite clearly directed at specific groups, usually Black, minorities, migrants, Palestinian in Israel, Uyghurs in China. So mass surveillance is, yes, massive, but it is also extremely discriminatory. And that, to us, is a major red line, in addition to the other violations of rights. But I think it's really important for people to understand that not everyone is affected by mass surveillance in the same way.
And this is often, I think, the tricky thing to try and raise concerns about this issue is that we are surrounded by different avenues and aspects of mass surveillance, whether it's CCTV cameras on the streets or our phone information or data being collected on us through social media. And there often isn't the same kind of alarm about this increasing technology, increasing sophistication of this technology. Why do you think that is?
Well, it has become normalized. We've been accustomed for the last 20 years or so, ever since, I will say, the war on terror. We have been accustomed to putting security at the heart of every kind of public policy. And there is absolutely no doubt that governments have an obligation to protect people on their territory. But there is also no doubt that this was well considered by international human rights law, and that the national security is to be framed within a human rights context. In other words, any measures in the name of security must be non-discriminatory, must be proportionate, and must be necessary. There is quite a lot of jurisprudence on how to assess proportionality and necessity. And in the many cases that we have investigated, we find that the test of necessity and proportionality are violated, often not even considered. It has been normalized in people's mind, but it does not mean that it should be normal or legalized.
We're also living through an artificial intelligence revolution.
Absolutely.
And that technology is advancing at a rate that is hard to comprehend.
Yeah.
I don't think there are a lot of people in the world that can even grasp, even the people that are working at the forefront of this technology don't understand how quickly it's advancing.
Yeah.
But there always exists, at every level of technological advancement, people that want to use it for different aspects. Mm-hmm. And certainly governments, security apparatuses, militaries are always at the forefront of these technological uses.
Yep.
What are we seeing happening right now in terms of AI and mass surveillance?
Well, AI-powered mass surveillance is really galloping, at the moment. One of the most common expression of that is facial recognition technology. So it has been around for a little while, but through the development of AI, it's becoming more and more sophisticated, less and less transparent, more and more massive, and less human rights compliant, in a nutshell. Facial recognition technology is intrusive. It is sending chilling effect to people. It allows for the not only the surveillance, but also the keeping huge amount of personal data on individuals, personal data that should not be kept by anyone, whether it's government or private companies. AI is also now used for technology that I will consider, and that many people consider, in fact, as pseudo-scientific. By this, I mean some aspect of the profiling system attached to people's behavior. So a certain kind of behavior is assimilated or considered to be indicating some kind of maybe propensity to act in a criminal way. Certain kind of emotions are considered to be associated with lies or with fears. So this kind of technology, we actually are seeing it being used already at borders in Europe, and that is sending alarm bells for us. The so-called deception detectors and other emotion recognition technology or tool really are extremely problematic for right to autonomy, a range of freedom, non-discrimination. The predictive analytic system, there is a huge literature on how problematic it is, how discriminatory it is, how wrongly, the many wrong conclusions that are associated with that. So we are seeing artificial intelligence powering our surveillance system, our controlling system of people at a rate which should really be sending alarm bell to all citizens and people around the world.
You mentioned the use of this technology at borders, especially in the EU. And one of the things that we've seen, and there's been a lot of reports around this, is use of surveillance drones, surveillance cameras at borders, specifically, with the aim of targeting migrants. To what extent do countries have the right to be able to protect and surveil their own borders? And at what point in time in your mind does that cross into something that is something else?
It's a very valid question. Right now, the control of borders have become zones where rule of law does not apply. They have become places where people are killed, more or less in impunity, where people are killed with indifference, where people are tortured and ill-treated, in the face of all, but in the complete indifference of the many. So those measures taken at borders in the name of controlling the borders are actually violating international law, whether it is human rights law, the Refugee Convention, the laws on trafficking, and the International Convention Against Trafficking, and so on and so forth. It is making people extremely vulnerable, both to border guards' excessive use of force. It is making people extremely vulnerable to criminal gangs, because every time a border becomes more difficult to cross, what it means is that criminal gangs are moving in and offering a service, which is to find ways of controlling, of subverting the system that has been put in place. So the control of the borders right now is militarized to such an extent that human rights are violated and people are dying. People are dying, people are ill-treated, people are tortured. This is what we have documented repeatedly. You were mentioning the drones, and it reminds me of that testimony I read that we documented of a migrant trying to cross into Croatia. There were drones which picked the migrants, particularly at night, and they will send signal to the police, who will then come and beat the migrants and push them back. So all of these practices are absolutely unlawful. Of course, beating migrants is unlawful. Pushing them back violates the principle of non-refoulement. And that is being made possible through the use of drones, which are artificial, often artificially intelligent, automated system.
And there's a lot of research and development at the moment to try and implement facial recognition into surveillance drones and create these systems that are very easy to use, very cheap to manufacture and widely implemented.
And as you know, in different contexts, the use of drones for targeted killings has proven to be far too often faulty. The way this technology has been used in the context of the war on terror is resulting in massive collateral damage for children, men and women who have nothing to do with any kind of behaviors that is being targeted. It is resulting in the wrong individuals being targeted. It is associating certain kind of behaviors, such as a group of people coming together with the possibility or the likelihood of that group being a terrorist group. In fact, in many cases, it may just be a marriage taking place and people are killed. So we need to understand that this technology is extremely problematic and is responsible for massive human rights violation.
Speaking of the war on terror, and this is something that I've heard you speak about before, the idea that over the course of the last 2 or so decades, the war on terror has changed a lot about how we speak about security. And I mean, in terms of, socially, but also legally, and in terms of what protections exist or don't exist, allowing governments and security apparatuses to pursue this kind of technology and this extreme level of surveillance that hasn't really existed before. What do you think was shifted, and have we lost anything as a result?
Oh, we lost a tremendous amount, absolutely. I mean, the war on terror has unleashed an attacks on individual freedom to an extent I don't think we've ever seen before. It has become a blueprint for any government around the world to target dissidents, to target human rights defenders, to target journalists. Let it be very clear. Yes, maybe so-called terrorists have been caught into that war, but I can assure you that the number of individuals whose main objective in life was to document human rights or to report on human rights violations, these individuals have been heavily targeted. There are many of them that are still languishing in prison, many of them that have been killed, and the shrinking of the civic space can be directly associated with the war on terror. There is absolutely no doubt that the war on terror is responsible for this massive rollback and for the negative direction of travel that we are experiencing right now as far as human rights protection is concerned. And to go back to our topic, artificial intelligence, mass surveillance technology has rendered this rollback and the shrinking of the civic space more possible, more likely. It has automated it, it has strengthened it, and it has almost normalized it.
If I ever felt that is looking at me, first of all, yes, that one up there. When you come over there, suddenly it rotates on you and it looks on you. It's facial recognition software that is mounted on cell phones that they get, but also using all of the cameras that we have in Hebron. Now in Hebron, it is the largest Palestinian city in the West Bank and the only Palestinian city with a settlement inside of it. And that's why we have about 800 settlers, about 650 soldiers guarding them on a daily basis. This kind of technology would make a sustainable occupation, because it further you and you're farther from the decision or from the injustice or from the feeling inside that I did something bad. So this kind of technology can do exactly that. Not thinking about Palestinians as human beings. They are my enemy. I need to treat them as an enemy, and everybody's an enemy. That's precisely what this technology is doing.
At the forefront of this change and this particular almost obsession with controlling this public space and monitoring it are tech companies that are developing, manufacturing, and testing and selling this technology. And I mean, one of the most high-profile ones in recent memory was the NSO Group, the Israeli company that was developing this phone hacking technology and selling it to a lot of authoritarian governments. But also when it comes to AI and monitoring, you also have companies such as Usto, the Israeli technology firm, and that has been accused, by organizations such as yours of using the Palestinian population as a testing ground for developing this technology. What can you tell me about that specific case?
Well, I mean, let's look first maybe at CSO and Pegasus, because it is still happening. In other words, almost every month, Amnesty International is documenting new cases of the use of spyware against human rights activists, journalists, dissidents. One of the last one I worked on with my colleagues was a journalist in Dominican Republic, Nuria Piera, who was targeted. And I wanted to maybe highlight what she had to say. You have to work hard to not become neurotic, because you're always suspicious that someone may have information about you. It's like being in quicksand. It really affects your sense of freedom, how free you feel to speak up. Sometimes you don't even know how they want to hurt you, through you or through your loved one. You then feel responsible, which is even more serious. So, her statements is very much in keeping with every victims of Pegasus, suddenly discovering that you have been under surveillance, that your communication has been captured by your government or other government. This is why Amnesty International has called for an immediate moratorium on the sale, transfer, export, and use of spyware, until we have in place a human rights framework that allows for that technology to be human rights compliant, which frankly is not happening anytime soon at the rate we're going. So that's one example. The other example you were mentioning is around the use of mass surveillance and particularly facial recognition technology in the context of Palestinian occupied territory. East Jerusalem and Hebron are the two places that we have investigated as Amnesty International. We have found that the Israeli authorities have used a facial recognition system called Red Wolf, which allows to capture every Palestinian going through the multiple borders, border point, control point in those areas. They are being scanned in ways. The data from the scan is linked to many other databases. And on the basis of that data, they are being profiled and allowed or not allowed to continue their journey. So that system has major problematic dimension. The first one is that it is discriminatory. It targets Palestinians only. The second is that it has a chilling effect on freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, possibly by implication, freedom of speech. It has allowed the Israeli authorities to maintain an enormous database of personal data, all of that in the name of security and national security. But again, the proportionality and the necessity test, in our opinion, have not been met. Each one of those tests carries an important protection for human rights. To target thousands of individuals in order to possibly capture one, that's not proportionate. There should be other ways. But to inflict such a massive form of surveillance on Palestinians. Crucially, that form of surveillance, automated surveillance as we call it, is part and parcel of the way the Israeli authorities are maintaining and imposing a system of apartheid. It is part and parcel of the system of control and oppression and discrimination against one racial group, Palestinians, by the Israeli authorities. That is why we are suggesting, and we have said, that this amounts to automated apartheid.
Let me ask you about a more seemingly benign application of this same technology. And earlier this year, you and Amnesty International raised the alarm about the proposed use of AI surveillance and facial recognition software in France in preparation for the upcoming Paris Olympic Games. Now that didn't quite, the government stopped short of allowing that kind of live facial recognition software to be implemented, but from what I understand, they still allow the use of AI, they still allow the use of that kind of surveillance to be implemented. What was so concerning to you about this proposal?
Well, the greatest concern is that millions of people, whether or not they are actually participating to the Olympic Games, will be captured, tracked, monitored by that system for, just because they happen to be in a certain type of neighborhood. Their behaviors will be captured. Certain kind of behaviors that could be seen as problematic will be captured in order to trigger some kind of policing reaction. All of these is predicated on pseudo-scientific data, which is really problematic. It's a form of profiling of behaviors, which is imposing maybe a form of control which goes way beyond what should be proportionate to the objective. If the objective of the government is to prevent people fighting or people behaving in ways that are problematic for the Olympic Games, surely there are other ways of doing it than to imposing this massive control over everyone's behavior. Again, the test of proportionality is not met. Also, I need to sadly point out that the French police has been responsible for massive excessive use of force in recent years, excessive use of force targeting minorities, targeting people who, the yellow vest individuals. It has resulted in dozens of individuals losing an eye or sight, I think up to 5 losing a hand. The police in France is using methods and weapons which under international law are prohibited for the purpose of managing crowd or managing demonstration and protest. So for all those reasons, the idea that you are creating this massive AI-powered mass surveillance is and should trigger a great deal of fears and red lines. That proposal from the French, well, it's not a proposal, in fact, the law is also, in our views, in contradiction with what the European Union is trying to adopt at the moment, which is an AI Act, an Artificial Intelligence Act, which is meant to really ensure that AI is used in the European Union in ways that are not in violations of fundamental freedom. The French government law has violated the spirit, certainly, of this act, which is being drafted or agreed at the moment.
When it comes to the AI Act, that is, there's been a list of proposals that have been put down. It's been agreed upon at an initial stage, and then now it's going to have to go through each individual country, and but throughout that entire process, there's also been a lot of powerful tech lobby groups that have been trying to challenge a lot of these factors. I mean, some of the things suggest the use or banning live facial recognition software being used in a public way. That you won't be able to interact with any AI system unless it's obvious that it's an AI system. And the argument from the tech sector is that these laws aren't realistic and they're not keeping up to speed with where the technology actually is right now, which is, in some aspects, we've moved so far beyond this point that, do you think it's possible to legislate this in a way that allows us to implement laws that are realistic, that are, or is this something that has the train run away with us?
No, I don't think so. I honestly don't think so. Not when it comes to surveillance. I think regulation and the legal framework, the policy framework that the EU is trying to put in place is absolutely fundamental. And no, we are not that far advanced that we cannot stop it. Technology is meant to support society, to support human development, to support our capacity to be autonomous, to be better human beings. It is not meant to control us. So this kind of arguments, to me, does not have any weight at all on balance. Now, it is correct to say that this is still a moving target. In other words, there are several drafts that are being proposed at the moment, 3 in fact, coming from the Parliament, the Commission, and the Council. Each of those drafts have different dimensions that Amnesty support or don't support. So where are for us the problematic aspect at the draft that we are looking at? The first is that there is a blanket exemption on national security ground in the draft proposed by the Council. That is a no-no. As I mentioned before, national security is the main driver through which human rights violations are being committed at the moment. So an exemption on those grounds basically will empty out the act. A second red line is the notion that companies could self-assess whether or not their systems are high risk. There is another proposal which has actually identified all the systems that are high risk. The idea that we should be instead moving to a self-regulatory approach by companies themselves, deciding what is high risk and is not, first of all, is not going to be workable for the purpose of protecting society. And second, is going to create a great deal of balkanization or fragmentation of the market, because each company will make their own assessment, government will then make their own assessment, the European Union will be extremely fragmented as a result. So that is also for us a red line. The other problems that we see with the proposal is that it is suggesting that companies that are exporting should be able to do so even if domestically or within the European Union their product has been deemed problematic and unlawful. That is not acceptable. So what? If it's not good for European citizens, it should be deemed not good for anyone else around the world. So that too must be tackled. I've already mentioned the situation of refugees and how at the moment the EU Act does not protect sufficiently migrants and refugees, and is creating a zone at borders which is no longer governed by the rule of law. It's as if it's not part of the European Union. That too is extremely problematic. So Amnesty International and others, as part of a coalition, is really trying to advocate for an European Union Act on AI, which is strong, which is really leading the way for leading the world in the way we should be regulating that technology. It is not meant to control us. We are supposed to control that technology for the betterment of our societies. And right now, there are many actors who are trying to push for its use, from some of the police, national security individuals, to private companies, for their shareholders, and that we need to put a stop to it. There need to be a strong understanding of what is acceptable under international law, under human rights law, and more generally common sense.
First of all, technology evolves. Innovation brings us forward and opens up new possibilities. And as legislators, we need to seize the opportunity. It is about change. It is about understanding that we cannot afford to remain stagnant, and about not being afraid of the future. Going forward, we are going to need constant, clear boundaries and limits to artificial intelligence. And here there is one thing that we will not compromise on. Anytime technology advances, it must go hand in hand with our fundamental rights and democratic values.
When I think about what this reality could look like without this kind of regulation that you're describing, it looks to me like what is happening and what has been happening for the last couple of years in China, in cities like Beijing, where there are hundreds of millions of facial recognition cameras that are set up, that are integrated, that have a database, and that are now being introduced into a social system where, in order to access your place of employment, you need to use your facial recognition software to pull money out of a bank. And of course, we're seeing the much darker side of this with the reports that are coming out of the Xinjiang region. Is this the kind of world that we could be looking at? Is this a realistic reality of what could happen without regulation?
Yes. I think there are many people around the world, particularly people that govern us, who are looking at what's happening in China with some kind of envy. We are confronting a trend and a situation where many officials, authorities, elected or not, are becoming fearful of their citizens and their people, and are constructing us as a mass that must be controlled, segmented, and whose behavior needs to be heavily regulated. That is a reality. China, in many ways, is demonstrating what can be done in a system where there is no dissent, where there is no people raising the alarm, where there is no civil society calling for proper regulation of governmental power. The situation is particularly worse in Xinjiang because this is another example of something that, for me, is extremely dangerous with AI. It is both the massive dimension of what AI allows and their specificity. So it is AI used to target specific racial or ethnic group. that is a door open to so much abuses. It is, if you look at our human history, the worst kind of violation that have happened have targeted specific groups, whether they were Jews, Romas, Muslims, blacks. I mean, that is the reality of our human history. Put into that a technology that strengthens, allows, multiplies the capacity of targeting one specific group, not one specific individual of that group, one specific group through that technology, and you are opening the door to the worst kind of possibilities. What's happening in Xinjiang is extremely dangerous for, of course, the population, the Muslim population of Xinjiang, but for everyone, because it is the implementation of a system that is targeting specific groups of people through various means, including looking at their behaviors to determine whether they could become radicalized or other things. That kind of technology is so dangerous. We see that technology and the mass surveillance of in Xinjiang as being part of the crimes against humanity that the Chinese government is perpetrating against that population, crimes against humanity, which includes arbitrary detention, administrative detention, torture and ill treatment, and worse.
With the dangers that you have described, with this application of this technology, what is possible and what is already happening as we can see in places like Xinjiang? And then on the other side, the kinds of mentalities that you've mentioned with regards to the people that are at the forefront of this issue, legislatively, technologically, the people that are racing excitedly to see where the logical endpoint of this revolution is going. Yeah. How do you talk to people in that space, the people that have the power to regulate this technology, that have the power ultimately to protect us from the misuses of it? How do you talk to them in a way that registers and appeals to this kind of sometimes morbid curiosity, sometimes healthy curiosity? What do you tell them?
Look, I think the first necessity is for the average individuals around the world to really take stock of what is happening. So it's not what I can say. It's about people coming together, citizens coming together, people in a territory coming together and saying that technology is creating a great threat to us, to our children, and to our societies. I think we're seeing more and more acknowledgement of it as AI is developing, galloping, and scientists themselves have raised the alarm about the fact that this is a technology that we are about to lose control of. So there is an increasing recognition of the risk associated with it. The problem that I see is elsewhere. The problem is that right now who control that technology control the world. That's very simple. So you have at least two superpowers that will be extremely reluctant to curtail the development of that technology for fear that the other superpower may not do so. So China and the United States really have the keys to the regulation of that technology. And at this particular moment in time, there is so much implications economically, militarily, politically, that none of those governments is prepared to consider, I think, the possibility of having some kind of international agreement around the development, the use, the export of that technology. So that, to me, is a fundamental problem. We are trying to regulate a technology that is an industrial revolution and that is at the heart of the conflict between superpowers. It is at the heart of the reconstruction of the multinational international system, and it is at the heart of economic powers. And, shareholders and a range of companies are made to make so much money over that technology. There is no real incentive at the moment except our voice, raising the alarm, and that of some scientists saying, guys, we're about to lose control of machine learning and artificial intelligence who could overpower us. We need to keep insisting and pushing for for what we know is a current reality of the use of mass surveillance, AI-powered mass surveillance, of the chilling effect it is creating on our societies, on the chilling effect it is creating on the exercise of fundamental rights. The fundamental risk with that technology is the fact that it can target specific groups. It not just targeting specific individuals, which we have already seen is having a chilling effect, but targeting entire communities on the basis of their race, ethnicity, of religion. That should really be sending shivers to everyone around the world, anyone with a little bit of knowledge of our human history. So we need to keep pushing this information. We need to keep reminding people of what that technology can do to our humanity. And we need to keep advocating for legislators to see the light. I'm hoping that the European Union Act could be a driver for a regulatory framework which will be sensible, which will be reflective of the risk and taking into account opportunities. And to do so, it really needs to be built on the international human rights standard.
And then where does this framework then go? Does it go to the United Nations? Is that where you'd like to see
well,
it?
I mean, initially, certainly, if we have the European Union adopting a good act, that will be a very important first step, particularly if it is an act that regulates companies and government in the European Union territory, but also in their behaviors outside, because quite a bit of European companies are exporting those technology, including, in fact, to Israel and to China, among other places. So if we can have an act that really regulates that technology in a human rights way, in a human rights compliant way, I think it will have ripple effect around the world. And the European Union has already shown the way globally in terms of the regulation of the large platform companies, Meta, Google, and so on. It's not coming from the US. It's not coming from China. It's the push for regulation, human rights compliant regulation, is really based in the European Union. So we need to push Europe to do the right thing and to continue to demonstrate that there is another way than the US or China way, that between the complete control and the complete laissez-faire, there is a way which is a European way, which should be human rights compliant.
Are you optimistic that we'll get this right?
I am optimistic that in the process of getting there, we're going to see a lot of conversation, a lot of people speaking, a lot of people's power being enacted, being, hopefully given more platform through the media, more awareness of what's happening, and that legislators hopefully will do the right thing.
Dr. Agnes Callamard, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Big Picture. Now, here's an interesting fact. Did you know that London has the most number of CCTV cameras per square kilometer out of any city outside of Asia? It's about 400 cameras per block of flats. The largest in the world is Chennai in India with 657 cameras per square kilometer. Beijing has the most amount of cameras of any city. It has, get this, 1.15 million CCTV cameras. Make of that what you will. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it. Please let us know what you think about this AI revolution, about surveillance technology. Are you worried at all? Maybe you're not. Maybe you think it's going to make us all safer. Let us know. As always, you can check out all of our episodes on our podcast platforms, wherever you get your podcast from. You can subscribe, give us a rating, tell your friends about it, and until next time, salam.